Welcome to the University of Michigan Dentistry Podcast Series, promoting oral health care worldwide.
In an age of electronics and computers, the recording of mandibular movement should be easier and less time-consuming. Denar Corporation has developed a pantograph, the Pantronic that is electronic. A computer analyzes the mandibular movements. There is no need to transfer the pantograph to the articulator to obtain the settings, which results in a considerable savings in time. In comparison, the gnathological instruments take approximately 1.5 to 3 hours to make clutches, assemble the pantograph, record movements, transfer to and set the articulator with ground inserts. The Denar mechanical pantograph takes approximately 1.5 hours to make clutches, assemble the pantograph, record movements, transfer to and set the articulator with straight inserts. The Denar Pantronic takes approximately 20 to 40 minutes to make clutches, assemble the electronic pantograph, and record movements. A computer analyzes the movements and prints out the setting for the articulator in less than a minute. The Denar pantograph comes in two cases. In the first case, the sensor sidearm assemblies sensor cable connector, micro-adjustable recording table sidearms, clutch angle protractor. Air hose connector, pantograph, air hose connector power supply. In the second case, the paper rolls, the computer, the power supply connector, the foot pedal. There are a number of components of the computer with which you should be familiar. On the keyboard, the reset button clears all information and readies the computer to begin again. The print button is used to receive additional copies of the printout. The advance button advances the paper through the computer. The clear entry button clears the last excursive movement made. This dual function key is used to record the clutch angle left and the reference plane. This dual function key is used to record the clutch angle right, and the plot is used to obtain graphic information. This dual function key, the 0 is the numeric value, and the stop is used to stop the computer during any stage. And these, of course, are the numeric values. On the left light panel on the computer screen, we see the right lateral, the left lateral, and the protrusive, and the number indicates which of the three excursive movements is being recorded. The ready light means the computer is ready to record the excursive movement, and the recording light indicates that the computer is indeed recording. The light under error indicates some error has been made. The too fast light indicates the movement has been made too fast. The memory full light indicates the computer is at its maximum capacity. On the back of the computer, is a rear door indicated by the arrow. The optional battery power pack. The power supply jack. The foot pedal jack. The sensor cable connector. The pantograph air hose hookup. The power supply air hose hookup. To insert the roll of paper used for the printout, open the top of the computer. Turn the computer on. Feed the paper into the slot and press the advance button. When the paper has advanced enough, close the cover. The conversion kit to convert the mechanical pantograph into the Pantronic involves the use of these component parts: new tracing tables, some different screws, and some plugs for the end of the anterior bars. Remove the posterior reference pins and also the tracing table. And then this side arm, which is the right one, will be turned over and become the left arm for the left table. This is necessary in order to attach it to the maxillary bow. Use the longer screw to attach this table to the side arm. And then, in order to get rid of the possibility of this screw contacting, this is removed and replaced with a small set screw. These black plugs are to be placed in the ends of the maxillary anterior bars to provide an area for the air connector for the styli. A dental clutch is an intraoral device which indexes to the teeth to which extraoral devices are attached to register anatomical relationships with mandibular paths of movements.
In making the clutches, we need a clutch jig which forms the bearing surface for the clutch. This is the bearing surface that will be formed in the clutch, and then working against that bearing surface will be a central bearing screw. It's a screw with threads and a head on it. The head goes into the hole and the threads stick out. Then we have clutch frames which can be attached to the clutch jig. The clutch frames can be shaped with a slow constant pressure. They can be bent to fit the dental arch. What we would like to have is the clutch frames being just wide of the buccal surfaces of the maxillary and mandibular teeth. The clutch frames are attached into the clutch jig. The clutch jig is offset The forward part is for the maxillary arch, and the part that is set back is for the mandibular arch. Now the screw heads that come through should be covered so that when the clutch is assembled to the anterior bars, the screws have some length to come through, so we put a little wax over the screw on each side of the clutch. Any suitable quick-setting acrylic resin can be used for the clutch. It should be a fast-setting resin so that it doesn't take so much time. You take the recommended manufacturer's portions and mix it together. Now we want to put the acrylic resin into the clutch, particularly in the bearing area, when the material is quite fluid, and then we need to wait for the material to set up a little bit before we put it in the rest of the area. But trying to get a smooth bearing area is very important. Now if we can get the very fluid material over this area first and then not disturb it, we'll wind up with a good bearing area. The acrylic resin is placed on both halves of the clutch at the same time. A bowl of water, warm water, can be used to control the set and keep the acrylic in the clutch former as we place it in the clutch former. Now it's important to work the acrylic out in certain areas. We want sufficient acrylic over the central bearing stud. We want it to be relatively thin over the occlusal surfaces of the teeth. We want it to be up on the anterior part of the frame to support that. Remember that the frame can be bent if it isn't supported, so we need the acrylic up on those areas. On the maxillary side, the same thing, thin over the occlusal surfaces and incisal edges of the teeth, up on the clutch frame, and then well over the bearing area. When it's of a sufficient stiffness, has some resistance, then it can be placed in the patient's mouth. When the acrylic has a sufficient texture to it, it's placed in the mouth. Be sure that this anterior holder part comes out of the mouth straight. What we want is to get slight indentations of the patient's teeth. Would you just touch on that, please? Touch lightly, lightly. And all we want to do at this point is to get slight indentations of the teeth in the clutch. Bite just a little bit more, please. Open, please. Close. Open. And then opening and closing, if you've got the indentations in there, we'll make them a little bit larger. Close again, please. Just touch that. Open. And we will put this back in the water and let it set up, get some more body, and then just before the final set, it should be placed back in the mouth so that it would take care of any warpage that could occur in the acrylic. Now just before the final set, we can put the clutches back in the mouth, have the patient close and hold it in that position to make sure that the acrylic hasn't warped. When I feel it getting warm, we take it out of the mouth. Open, please. Now we can see here that we have what I would consider the right amount of indentation. It may be just a little bit too much, and we'll trim these areas back a little bit until we get the right retention of the clutch. When the acrylic is warm and is set up firmly, as it is in this case, we can then take it out of the clutch jig by loosening the 2 screws. And then we have our clutch with the bearing area and the central bearing screw. We start out by opening the central bearing stud 1 turn to give us the separation that we want between our clutches. So open the bearing screw approximately 1 complete turn. We will take the clutches now to the lathe, trim away any excess acrylic, trim back a little bit of the indentations, particularly around the incisal edges of the teeth, and then we're ready to test the clutches in the mouth. The clutches have been trimmed on the heels to get rid of any interferences and to get rid of any sharp or rough edges. The indentations around the teeth have been relieved. The acrylic tends to shrink and make the clutch fit tighter, particularly if you've made the clutch 1 week and are going to use it the next week. The central bearing area should be smooth and free of imperfections. Have the patient go through the movements and see where the Gothic arch tracing is being made and make sure that it is smooth in those areas. The procedure calls for 3 movements in each direction. To aid the patient in the protrusive movement, a protrusive groove can be placed in there, but this is an option. We put the clutches in the mouth. Checking them out to see if they're accurate and stable. Rub forward, please. Rub all the way back. Rub forward and all the way back. When you first put the clutches in the mouth, you can have the patient just move around freely. Just go ahead and rub against those and feel the bearing area rubbing against the bearing stud, rubbing against the bearing area. If the patient is told to rub, then they will keep the clutch in contact. The patient can feel the rubbing movement. To ensure that the heels are not contacting, take some marking paper. Rub forward, please. Place between the heels of the clutch. Rub back again, please. Now rub each shoulder. Rub the other shoulder. Check each side. Rub forward and back. Check each side to make sure that they're not contacting in the heel area. Rub forward and back. Rub each shoulder. Now, the ideal clutch for the mechanical pantograph should come out fairly easy because they'd have to be taken out together. For the Pantronic, deeper indentations are permissible. But the ideal clutch, you can see, is very thin over the teeth areas. You can see light coming through the clutch. The clutch should not open the vertical dimension more than 8 to 10 millimeters. In order to orient the Pantronic on the patient's head, we need to have a plane. The plane is established by the anterior reference point and the 2 posterior reference points. The anterior reference point is measured up from the incisal edges of the anterior teeth using the ruler with the notch in there, and we place a point on that ruler on the side of the nose. We're going to have to line up both sides, so we sight and transfer that point over to the other side of the nose. And by sighting over there, transfer that point to the other side of the nose. Then we want to have a posterior reference point. This can either be the location of the terminal hinge axis kinematically or the arbitrary hinge axis. The arbitrary hinge axis can be recorded from the ruler again, which extends from the upper border of the tragus of the ear out to the corner of the eye, and then a mark is placed in the little hole in the ruler, and that marks our posterior reference point. Same thing on the other side. Coming out from the upper border of the external auditory meatus and out on a line to the corner of the eye, and we make our point. To aid us in aligning the horizontal plane indicator, we would put a line on the face that is aligned with the posterior and anterior reference point. This is done by placing the ruler alongside the face, aligning with those 2 points, and then making a line along the ruler. Please. Open, close. Squeeze a little on that, make sure they're seated firmly, rub forward and back. We make sure that the clutches are stable. Rub to this shoulder, back, rub forward and back, rub to this side and back. Now the thumb is on the chin, both to feel when the patient is moved in the correct position and also to make sure that the patient doesn't open off of the central bearing stud during the movements. To assemble the Pantronic on the patient, we need the anterior bars from the mechanical pantograph. We attach the mandibular bar to the mandibular clutch. Here again, make sure we have the patient's lip back out of the road so that we don't pinch the patient's lip. These can be tightened up rather firmly, but counteract the tightening rotation. The upper anterior bar is attached to the maxillary clutch. We will use the anterior tracing tables. We have tracing papers on there, and these should be oriented on an arc from the axis position. The table has a posterior reference pin that will be lined up over the posterior reference point. The micro-adjustable sidearm with the tables on it is assembled on the maxillary anterior crossbar. We want the reference pin to just touch the skin and be centered over the posterior reference point. We attach it to the anterior bar with this screw. With this adjustment, we can make gross adjustments forward and back. We can take it grossly back in the vicinity of the reference point. And then with these two screws adjustments, we can raise and lower the reference point until it centers over the posterior reference point. Before we use the micro adjustments, we have to undo these lock screws. This one here for up and down movements of the posterior reference pin, and this screw here for the anterior-posterior reference pin. Then we can sight through the table and line that posterior reference pin on the posterior reference point, raising and point up and down and backwards and forwards until it is lined on that point. We then tighten the lock screws. All these screws should be tight so that they don't come loose during the movements. One of the causes of erratic movements or recordings is the loose screws. Okay, move your head down this way. We can see here that we have the posterior reference pin oriented over the posterior reference point and just contacting the skin. To obtain the right horizontal plane angle, we can align the protractor, the black line on this protractor, up with the line that we have on the side of the patient's face. So we raise that up, and then we can see from our scale the right horizontal plane angle, which in this case is 9 degrees. Each increment on the protractor is 2 degrees, so we're halfway between 8 and 10, which would give us 9 degrees for a right horizontal plane angle. We now want to assemble the sensor arm onto the patient. We use the right R for the right side. Each one of the sensor styli has a little donut that holds the sensor out away from the table, and then each one has a rubber band that activates the stylus. So we connect the rubber bands to each one of the sensors. Push the donut in, and then the rubber band that comes straight out to the sensor is connected. We slide the donut down and then connect the rubber band. Now this has an elbow joint so that we can align the styluses at right angles to the table. We tighten that momentarily. The sensors are aligned on the table in relationship to these 2 points. We have a circle here on the vertical table and a circle here on the posterior reference table. The horizontal stylus will be oriented over this axis point, and the sagittal stylus will be oriented over that circle. We can now put the right sensor arm on the mandibular anterior crossbar. Through using the anterior adjustment and the elbow adjustment back at the sensors, we can center those 2 styluses over those 2 reference points. Using the elbow adjustment here, we want to have the vertical stylus at right angles to the horizontal table, and then we make our final adjustments by moving the styli in and out, up and down, until they are centered over those. Once we have the styluses oriented correctly, we can pull the donuts back so the styluses will contact the table. It is wise to have the patient go through the movements to make sure that the styli stay on the tables. So rub forward and back, forward and back, rub to each shoulder and back. Okay, good. Once we have the sensors oriented to the tables, we want to go ahead and use the 2 anterior tables to tell whether the patient is making the correct mandibular movement. So we connect our air supply, and that is connected on the back of the computer box, and we connect our rubber bands to activate the styli. All of the things have been plugged into the back of the computer, and when we can turn the computer on, it prints out the basic information about the patient and stops and asks us for the right horizontal plane angle. And this we have measured from the protractor on the table, and on the right side it is 9. Push the 9 and the RP button. The computer accepts this and asks for the left reference plane angle, which was measured at 8. So push the 8 button and the RP button. The computer accepts this and stops and asks for the clutch angle. The clutch angle is measured using the protractor. It has a slender part here that fits into the end of the table arm. It is pushed in until it contacts, and then the extension contacts the opposite table arm. And we have a scale over here that we read, and this reads 3 degrees left. So our clutch angle would be 3 degrees L. Clutch angle then is 3 degrees. We punch the 3, and the L button here is for left. Once we have those bits of information into the computer, we're ready to walk the patient through a series of movements. And we make 3 movements to each lateral movement and 3 in the protrusive movement. Would you rub forward, please? And back. When the patient is back, we can push on the foot pedal. We hear a beep, and then when the patient makes a movement, they make the movement until they hear the second beep. Come towards me, please. And we hear the beep, then we release the foot pedal, have the patient come back, forward, all the way back. We verify with the anterior stylus that the patient is all the way back. If they are, rub towards me, please. Back until we hear the beep. Forward and back, all the way back. Rub towards me, back, forward, all the way back. Now this time we're going to rub away. Rub away from me, back. One practice time, rub forward and back. Rub away, back. Rub forward and back. Rub away, back. Rub forward and back. The patient did not repeat the centric point. We want to clear that movement. To clear the movement, push the CE button. Forward, back. Forward, back. Forward, back. Forward, back.
At this point, the computer would begin to print out the information just recorded. Patient information would have already been entered. The reference plane entered before the tracings began would also have been printed out, as would the clutch angle. The R and L preceding each abbreviation signifies the patient's right and left condylar paths of movements. The immediate side shift, progressive side shift, orbiting paths, protrusive paths if using flat superior wall in Articulator, superior wall inserts, protrusive paths if using specified superior wall inserts, medial wall inserts, rear wall inclination, forward or backward, top wall inclination, up or down. In order to print the first plotted graphs simulating numeric readouts, press the plot key and the number 1 button. In order to print the other 2 plots, depress the plot key and key number 2, and then the same for plot number 3.
The Pantronic provides condylar measurement information in 2 ways, numerics and graphics. In using the numerics to set the articulators, it can be used a couple of ways. If you wanted to set using flat superior wall inserts and straight medial wall inserts, then you would use a certain combination of the settings. You would use the immediate side shift settings, the progressive side shift settings, the orbiting path, the protrusive path, settings along with any information about the rear and top wall settings. If you are going to use a curved medial wall, such as indicated here for an early wall, then you would go back and wouldn't use the immediate side shift, but instead you would use the early insert for the immediate side shift. If you were going to use a curved superior wall, if this were recording, would come up with a 3/4 inch superior wall, then we would use that insert plus the condylar settings that are listed here with the prime would be used with the curved inserts in the articulator. So you have options of using a couple of combinations of the settings plus what you would desire to have set into the articulator. These settings can now be put into the articulator by making a series of screw adjustments. The immediate side shift is placed in the articulator by loosening this screw, and then using this scale, the tenths of immediate side shift can be placed into the articulator. Progressive side shift by loosening this screw, and using this scale we can put the desired amount of progressive side shift in there, which is 4 degrees in this particular case. The rear wall settings, if they're recorded, can be put in using this screw and this scale, either a forward or backward movement of the working condyle. Then we can make adjustments for the top wall. By loosening this screw, we can change the angle of the top wall and put the top wall settings in to produce a down or an up movement of the working condyle. In this case, we had no top wall recording, so we would leave that set at 0. We can put the condylar inclination into the articulator by this screw adjustment. By loosening this screw, we can change the angle of the superior wall to put the condylar inclination in there for our protrusive path. And we can also use this to change the condylar inclination to match the orbiting path settings from the numerics. If we want to use the different medial wall and superior wall inserts, we could remove this screw, remove this flat medial wall insert, and put one of the early or distributed side shifts into the medial wall. In this instance, the early side shift was called for on the left medial wall. If we wanted to use the curved superior walls, we could remove this screw, remove this insert, and put one of the curved superior wall inserts in there, either the 1/2 inch, the 3/4 inch, or the 1 inch curved superior wall. So using any combinations of settings and inserts, we can set the articulator to the settings recorded by the Pantronic. At the end of a recording session, you would have numerics for setting the articulator and graphics plots for diagnostic value. The basics is 1 numerics and 3 plots, 1 plot for each one of the movement. Plot number 1, 2, and 3 for each one of the 3 movements. The 3 movements have been averaged so that you will get a single number on the numerics or the articulator settings. Since you have the apparatus on the patient's face, it takes very little time to repeat the sequence, so I would advise that you take 3 or 4 sets of numerics so that we can look at the numbers, see if they're consistent, and look at the plots to determine if there are any abnormal recordings in this information. If there are abnormal recordings, they could be caused by 3 things. 1, the dentist. 2, the equipment. and 3, the patient. The movements are dentist assistant but patient directed. The dentist gives the patient as much assistance as is needed to obtain the best sets of movements. Proper assistance comes from experience and practice. If you go to the numerics, you can see whether there are abnormal recordings present. You would look across the 3 numerics to see if the numbers are consistent. You see here we have 3 zeros going across the 3 numbers. That is very consistent. Our research indicates that the 3 or 4 recordings should be within 0.2 of a millimeter of each other. Here, the recordings across the left immediate side shift is well within our 0.2 of a millimeter of immediate side shift. In the progressive side shift, you would compare the numbers again, and they should be within 2 degrees of each other. You can compare the protrusive. The protrusive condylar inclination should be well within 3 degrees to be considered normal. If you find that the numbers are varying between the 3 or 4 different numerics, then you might suspect that one of the causes would be the assistance given by the dentist. The immediate and progressive side shifts can be influenced by the dentist, particularly if the patient has some dysfunction present. The anterior tracings can also be used to tell whether the movements have been correct, and we will discuss these at a later time. The equipment can be handled and assembled incorrectly and cause erroneous readings. The styli must be positioned correctly. The screw adjustments must not change. After each set of recordings, be sure that the styli remain in the circles. If they have moved, correct their position, tighten the screws, and repeat the recordings. There may be some malfunctioning of the computer that would show up in the recordings. If we were to look at the recordings, along the different recordings, there are certain averages that the readings should record. For example, here we noticed that there was a low reading on the orbiting and protrusive path. It is highly unlikely that the reading would be this low, so we might suspect that something is happening in the recording. Also, we're recording an asterisk here, which is not normal, and an asterisk in this position. So we would look for something that was causing that particular error in the recording. There are 2 possibilities. One would be that the operator forgot to move the donuts up and the sensor styli are not recording against the table. And this would give us our low reading. We're not getting the reading of that sensor. This would be mainly the reading that we put in for the horizontal plane reference point. Also, if the donuts were raised and the stylus were touching and you still got a recording like this, it might indicate that there is some error in the computer recording due to the styli or something in the computer program. So you would look for those errors. The thing that is interesting to note that once the reading is, even though it's erroneous, is recorded, it is recorded very precisely and consistently across the 3 or 4 different numerics, the same way with the asterisk. This would indicate that it might be best for you to take a couple of sets of recordings, review the settings, see if they are normal numerics for a patient before you took the pantograph off the patient. If they were not, you could go back and look and correct these possible errors. Our studies have shown that patients with normal muscles and temporomandibular joints can make reproducible mandibular movements as shown by this set of anterior tracings. If you note here, the patient in the movements in all directions, the 3 times in each movement, appear as a single line. This shows that the patient has very good muscle coordination, the equipment was working correct, and the dentist was giving the proper assistance. If the dentist assistance and the equipment are correct, then the abnormal tracings can be due to TMJ dysfunction. In this set of tracings, the dysfunction is apparent in the multiple centrics that the patient has here. The patient can't come back to a consistent centric relation position. Also, multiple lines in the lateral movements would also indicate that there is some dysfunction present. The muscles are not relaxed and will not. However, if the tracings do not show abnormal movements, this is not indicative that there are no dysfunction problems present, because our studies have shown that it would take all 6 tables of the pantograph to make this diagnosis. If the patient has indications of dysfunction problems, then it would probably be wise to put the patient on a splint and use occlusal splint therapy and or occlusal adjustments. The plots can also be used to determine whether the movement patterns that were made were normal or abnormal. The movements come out on the plots as a series of dots, and these dots can be joined either with a pencil or a pen. As you can see here, we can join this series of dots with a pencil, and this will show us our tracing. We have represented in these 2 recordings here the information about the immediate and progressive side shift and also the medial wall information. The rear and top wall information is printed out in these plots, and the information about the condylar inclination is printed out in this set of plots along with the superior wall insert. To use the plots to determine if the movements were correctly, we need to superimpose now the 3 separate plots. We have here an acetate that can be used to retrace the 3 plots. So we take one of the plots, insert it into the acetate that is provided. We want to then line the acetate corners up with the corners on the plot. So we can line each plot up the same. And then we will trace the line of the plots onto the acetate. Once we have that one traced, and we remove number 1 and put in the number 2 plot. Line up the corners again. And trace plot number 2. We have here the 3 sets of plots superimposed on the acetates. This is similar to the anterior tracings that we had on the anterior tracing tables. We can look at this and see how consistent or how reproducible the movements were. We can see here from the 3 movements on the right side that they were very consistent and very reproducible. We look at the 3 movements on the left side, we can see some discrepancy between the 3 different movements, and this might indicate that there was some difficulty or some problem in making those 3 movements. And the problems could be created by any of the 3 things listed previously. This graphic will be used to give some idea of where the Pantronic fits into the schema of recording of mandibular movements. If we arrange the method of recording mandibular movements on a scale from none to recording all of the mandibular movements, we can see by comparison where the Pantronic fits in. Check bites, mini recorders, and fossa inserts record some of the mandibular movements. None of the methods will record all of the mandibular movements. The generated pass, the Stewart and Denar mechanical pantographs, and the Pantronic record a major portion of the mandibular movements. The important distinction to make is that there is a great difference from check bites to pantographs. However, there is much less difference between the methods used at this end of the scale. This TV tape is designed to be used in conjunction with the Denar Pantronic Technique Manual.
You've been listening to a presentation from the University of Michigan School of Dentistry, which is dedicated to supporting open learning and open educational resources. This recording is licensed under the Creative Commons. It may be reused and redistributed for nonprofit use. Please attribute materials to the University of Michigan School of Dentistry and redistribute under this same license. For more information on how this and other University of Michigan School of Dentistry recordings may be used, visit www.dent.umich.edu/license.